Stephan,
Hi, how are you?
hi. I hope I'm pronouncing that right.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Do you think you could take a second to tell us a little bit about yourself? Just introduce yourself to everyone here.
Sure. Well, I grew up in France a long time ago, and my parents had a store that not only had comic books, but also Super 8 millimeter films of Disney movies and stuff like that, magazine, and a bunch of other stuff. But those things can capture my imagination. And so my entire life is, I've been doing animation, which was the bulk of my career until 10 years ago, where uh, um, I remember like, oh, I also want to do comics, by the way, and started doing comics too, and I'm just having a blast doing both. And in the process, what was really interesting for me with that place where my parents' store is that there was art, but there was film, but there was literature. So to me, it all kind of came together as one thing, which is just basically storytelling, which includes, there's a visual side, there's a filmic side, there's a writing side, but they all work together and they all work pretty much with the same principles. And whichever specialty you have in any of those areas, you're still performing and telling that same story. So everybody needs to have the same sort of understanding and familiarity with the storytelling process, and that was kind of the essence of this talk.
Yeah, I understand it's the survival guide for writing.
Yeah.
Uh, I I know you sent us a pre-recorded video to play. Did you want us to go ahead and play that right now?
Yes, I can just set it up real quick. So it's just a 20-minute video, and so what I'm trying to present in there is just to boil down the most important sort of, a compass to keep in mind when you're writing story. And so to think about it simply, because I think when you start doing story, it feels very complicated and stuff like that, and just like a simple way to think through it. And it's and of course it branches. So like the first half of it is really a lot of technical, I don't want to say technical advice, but it's about the structure of story, which is a craft that's been well, explained already. So I'm, these are not new concepts, but they're still as relevant as ever. And then the second part is I'm putting more of a personal spin on it, which I think is relevant with the world as it is today. So it's just 20 minutes. We can watch that, and then I'll be happy to have a conversation and answer any question or comments or anything.
Right. So exactly. Right after this video, we're going to open up to Q&A. So if you guys have any questions you want to ask, go ahead and type them in the Q&A. We're going to do our best to answer all of them.
Awesome.
And without further ado, I guess I'll transition to this video.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, we're not getting the sound yet, I think. You can't quite see the other side of it. A question I get asked fairly often is whether story becomes easier with experience. And I think it's a great question, but the word easier might be the wrong word. I think it's more about simpler. Storytelling does become simpler. When you first start learning the craft, it feels like this mountain of complexity that you're trying to climb and you can't quite see the other side of it and stuff. But after a while, a certain simplicity starts to emerge. So let's start with the most basic aspect of a story, right? That it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that sounds obvious and self-evident, but really landing those is not. So let's talk about that, because that's the foundation that makes any story work. So at the beginning of the story, there has to be a handshake. What does that mean? So let me say I'm telling you a story in real life. For instance, so I get on the bus this morning, and you're not gonna believe, there's this woman, and she seems very nice, but she's got a red coat, and then this guy who has a dog with him, not too aggressive, the dog, but not super friendly, you know what I mean? And then the door opens, and this other guy. All right, so there's no way as an audience you can get on board with that story. And it's not by lack of understanding, because you understood every word I said, but you don't know how to feel about them, right? And so as an audience, you can't relax and get on board with the story because you don't know what you're in for. So doesn't mean, of course, that you have to tell them everything, but you have to create that handshake. So for instance, that's why in real life, if I was telling you a story about the bus, it would go like this. I'd go like, dude, you're not going to believe what happened this morning on the bus. Oh, really? What happened? No. It's fine. It's cool. No one got hurt, but check this out, right? So now we're ready for the story. We're relaxed and ready to engage. And that was going to be a positive story, probably, or an amusing story, but sometimes it's not the case. Maybe I see you down the street and I go like, oh boy, I gotta tell you, I'm very, very sorry. Joe passed away. And you're like, oh, Joe, but I just saw him yesterday, was in good health. And yeah, so let me tell you what happened. And here too, now we're ready for the story. It's probably going to be a bad story, but we're ready for it because there has been a handshake from storyteller to audience that makes the storytelling process now possible. Another crucial aesthetic element to storytelling is as follows. Every story lives on the scale between imagination and immediacy. Imagination and immediacy. So imagination doesn't require any explanation, right? It's like all the fun stuff that you can come up with that gets people to buy the book or go, see the movie. That's fine. But immediacy is the fact that the audience can immediately relate to the material, that they have an emotional and logical and in all sorts of ways that a mind can engage with something, that there's an immediate understanding of things. So for instance, let's pitch Raiders of the Lost Ark, and let's do it this way. So it's pre-World War II, and the Nazis are getting ready for war, and they're going everywhere around the world looking for secret weapons that they can have in their back pocket to win the war whenever they start it. And the CIA sends this guy who's like an adventurer / archaeologist to find this one secret weapon before the Nazis do. Okay, great. So that pitch is 100% immediacy. What that means is that you not only immediately understood every single word of it, but you knew how to feel about it, right? So pre-World War II, yeah, I get that. The Nazis, ooh, they're bad, trying to get secret weapons so they can win the war. I get it. But it's like, wait, but why is it special? Well, it's not quite special yet because it's missing one thing, which is that, and the secret weapon everybody's after is the Ark. So now that's imagination. And so when you're listening to the pitch, the actual pitch, which should be pre-World War II, the Nazis are looking for secret weapons all around the world to get ready for the war. And this guy who's an adventurer and an archaeologist tries to get to that ultimate weapon before they do, the Ark of the Covenant. They will bring the power of God on earth for 1,000 years and stuff. So when you're listening to this pitch as a listener, what your reaction is intended to be is that you're like, I get it, makes sense. Oh yeah, gotcha. What? And that is kind of the ratio of immediacy to imagination that you want. Because much imagination, you may still understand what I said, but you're not going to know how to feel about it. So that brings us to the end of the beginning. And the end of the beginning is the moment when the audience understands what's going on. They're on board. emotionally, mentally, all that stuff. But most importantly, they understand what the character is trying to do. And that is the essence of the dramatic form. It's contained in this one sentence, which, if I remember correctly, is a Robert McKee concept. The phrase is coined that way. Is that every story goes like this: someone has to do something that is really hard, and something terrible will happen if they fail. It sounds incredibly simple, but it's actually very hard to check all those boxes. Like someone, like a professor who's also an archaeologist, that's interesting, never seen that one before, has to find this secret artifact that's been hidden for 6,000 years before the Nazis do it. Hard to do. Or they will get it first, the Nazis, and then rule the world for 1,000 years. Super bad. That is the form. There is nothing else. So what's really interesting, though, is that that form is a fractal one. And what I mean by it is that it works, and it is actually what makes the story work at every scale. Because you've seen it when I was pitching Raiders as the whole movie, but it also works in every single scene. So for instance, the opening sequence of Toy Story. A bunch of toys who are alive when you're not watching, that's someone, that's interesting, have to cross this entire human birthday party undetected, hard to do, to try to make sure that in the present there's not a super cool toy that, you know, if they let him in, if there was one and they let him in, he may displace their entire social emotional order that they have as toys in this house, which from their standpoint would be extremely bad. So as you can see, the exact same form, and again I will repeat, that is the form, there is nothing else. Not only works on the scale of the movie, but it works on every, you know, for every sequence. And what's interesting is also with the Toy Story example is that it's the introduction to a character. And how to introduce a character dynamically is a key question, and the answer is also in this form. Because what you do not want to do is the, you know, Miss Marple, you know, like as you may or may not know, you know, so and so, who was the you know, two characters start talking to each other about a third character. That's, you know, among the people I always quote who I think are masters of storytelling and are very inspiring, like David Mamet, for instance, is one. And he always said that never have a scene, if you can avoid it, with two people talking about a third one who's not there. The way we care about characters is by seeing them try to do something hard that would have dire, and where failure would have dire consequences from their standpoint. And as humans, that's enough for us to get on board. All right, so now we have our story in motion. Now we get to the second part, which is crucial, which is the middle, and which is the part where people very often get stuck, right? So in the middle, something happens. And what I mean by that is something happens that flips the whole story around. For instance, Star Wars again. Now it's the middle of the movie. Luke is on the Millennial Falcon with Obi-Wan, and it looks like he's pretty good with the Force. And for the first time, we hear that the Force has a dark side. And if you go into it with ego, the dark side will take you. And at that moment, the entire story hinges. And where the first part was the wish fulfillment of maybe becoming a Jedi, the second part become hopefully escaping the curse of the Sith. So that point where the want and the need start to transition into each other, and the central conflict for the character goes from trying to actualize the want into either accepting or denying the need, that is the core of the movie. And that point in the story is when you get what I call the pun in the title. And what I mean by that is that you realize that the title has a different meaning that you thought. Like, The Walking Dead. Oh yeah, The Walking Dead, zombies, it's obvious, right? Except deeper in, you realize that no, actually the Walking Dead that the title refers to is not the zombies, it's the humans who are walking around but still kind of fighting to retain their humanity or not. So now it's the very end of the story, and Luke is exactly in the position that he wanted to be in, which is that he's a pilot, he's piloting the ship, who's gonna save everything. He's all set for the big hero move / the biggest ego move. But what have we learned in the middle of the story? We've learned that if you go into the Force with ego, then the dark side may take you. So what does he do? He always wanted to be a pilot, but at the final moment, let's go of the wheel. He's no longer in charge, no longer piloting. So Luke may go from farm boy to hero, but most importantly, the point of the story is he's going from ego to humility. And so at the end of the story, if the character embraces the need, then it's a hero story. If the character rejects the need and doubles down on the want, then it's a tragedy. So this was the form as it's generally understood in our storytelling culture. And of course, it can be used to tell an infinite number of stories. But I have to say, and it's a personal point of view, I feel like under all stories ever told for humans by humans, there is actually one unique story underneath, and it's the meta-human story. And I think on a certain level, it's always the same. And the story goes like this. Our forebears, fathers, grandfathers, mothers, grandmothers, elders, you name it, have either achieved amazing greatness or committed unspeakable sins. So how do we live up to their greatness or live down their sins? And how do we rank compared to them? That's it. That is the meta-human story, like I said, and it's in everything. It's, of course, very easy to spot in movies like Star Wars and so on and so forth, but really it's in everything. And I know we're going to do a Q&A, so if you guys want to throw out stories at me, if I know them, I'll tell you how they think this thing plays out in them. But that is my deepest held story belief, is that is the mono story at the root of everything. So, and by the way, if you think it doesn't exist in real life, then you have to take another look, because look even at the bigger than life level that control our own lives. So look at George W. Bush, for instance, right? So his dad was a war hero, head of the CIA, president of the United States, big shoes to fill, right? And he was the ne'er-do-well, the guy who was never going to amount to anything, except he does become president, and then something happens. Literally your midpoint in the story, 9/11. And at that point, what was the one thing that the first Bush was, said to not have done? Was he couldn't get Saddam. He didn't get Saddam. So what is W going to do now? One up his dad. The only thing he can do that didn't do, now he's going to get Saddam. And, Saddam Hussein had absolutely nothing to do with 9/11 whatsoever. Doesn't matter. That whole dynamic was at play, right? It's just like, how do I rank compared to my dad? How can I not only live up to him, but do the one thing he couldn't get to do? And look at where we are now with Trump, right? I mean, I'm recording this before the election, so who knows what's going to happen? But who can deny, whether you like him or not, and I'll be perfectly frank, I don't like him at all, but that, the whole Trump story comes from a father that was a bigger than life figure that made him feel like he was better than everyone and yet never good enough. And a guy who's going to spend his life tragically trying to desperately prove him right and prove him wrong at the same time. And here we are. So this takes me to the next question, which is very often asked, which is story political? And I think what people mean by that really is story partisan. And I don't think it is, in the sense that you could very well imagine a story that is exploring a collectivist point of view, or a story that is exploring an individualistic point of view. So there's no inherent bias. In fact, I think that is the whole point of story, which is our shared humanity. It's about exploring other people's point of view. It's walking through the shoes. It's walking in the shoes, or seeing the world through the eyes of people who in real life you have no connection with, right? This is how you have stories about mafia people, about dictators, about serial killers, about, as well as you have from heroes and children. And that is the point. The point is the sharing of that common human experience, which is, of course, very important, because this is the fabric of living in society. And that is actually the difference between legitimate storytelling and propaganda. Because the point of propaganda is dehumanizing people, right? It's like, look at them, they're bad. We need to, lock them up, kill them, whatever, right? That's the whole point of propaganda, is dehumanizing. And that is the exact opposite of story, which is sharing that human experience. So story may not be inherently partisan, but that does not mean it's symmetrical either. Certain things in life are not symmetrical, like time is not symmetrical. You remember yesterday, you don't remember tomorrow. And story works the same way. Take comedy, for instance, right? There's something that happened a few years ago that was really funny, like going back to the Bush years again. That's when The Daily Show with Jon Stewart was really gaining in popularity and influence in the culture. And Fox News decided, like, yeah, we can do this, we can be funny too, we can do comedy. And they started this block, that was supposed to be the counter programming to The Daily Show. And it was horrible, and they had to cancel it like after 5 minutes, because comedy is about punching up. It's telling truth to power. If you're on the side of power, it doesn't work, right? It's the poor guy making fun of the emperor who has no clothes. That's comedy. The emperor making fun of the poor guy who has no clothes. That's just cruelty. Does not work. So just like time, story is not symmetrical. It is always on the side of humanity versus oppression, of compassion versus cruelty, of truth versus lies. And it's never on the side of putting kids in cages, right? But if story is a moral concept, and we know story doesn't judge, because otherwise we wouldn't have movies about mafia people, about dictators, hell, we have movies about Hitler, right? And so how does story express its sense of morality? And the answer is, it does not have to, because it is the characters who do it themselves. And it all takes place with that final choice at the end. If they choose to run into the burning building to save people, it's a hero story. If they push people out of the way into the flames so they can get out, it's a tragedy. If they choose their family, wife and kids, it's a hero story. If they choose to become the new godfather, it is a tragedy. And through that final choice, this is how story is able to orient its moral universe without separating us from the people in the story that we are trying to, without disconnecting our common humanity. So there you go. That's how I think it works. This is kind of my compass, my true north that I usually always try to keep in mind when I'm writing and creating a story. I hope this helps you too. And I know we have a Q&A coming up, so I cannot wait to hear your questions.
Oh, wow. I think I see a rewatch in my future for that one.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, is there anything you wanted to add to the video before we move on into Q&A?
No, I think whatever I have to add, I think I can say it in the context of the questions, and that way people, it'll connect more with the questions people have.
All right, I'm going to jump into this first question here, which is asking if stories more or less follow the same archetypes, how can storytellers tell fresh, new stories?
Oh, that's a great question. That's a fantastic question. I think when you start as an artist, whether of a storyteller of any kind, I think we always have a couple of false notions at the beginning. The first one is we want to be original. We're afraid that, well, I've seen this before, blah, blah, blah. But originality is not a goal. It's an end result, right? And it's the result of you being you and telling the story about specific people. For instance, let me give you an example, right? Take 3 movies that no one would accuse them of being the same movie, in the sense that you watch those movies and you do not have the same cinematic experience, right? I would say Dances with Wolves, Avatar, and Pocahontas. It's the same story. It's not the same movie. Why? Because in every case, the movie is connecting with a different truth, a different, a voice, a different, and so no one went to see Avatar and went like, I've seen this before. It was called Pocahontas. It's just like, no, you're watching a different movie. So trying to be, John Buscema, who used to be one of the key Marvel artists of the 60s and 70s, had this. I heard had this phrase, which is when you're copying somebody's style, you're just copying their mistakes. So you don't want to copy people's style, because that doesn't get you anywhere. You don't want to try to be different from the sake of being different, because that doesn't get you anywhere either. You just want to honestly get to the truth of the story that you're telling, and the characters whose story it is. And as you keep writing your story and performing it, that's something else when you talk about performance is key in story. The truth, little by little, kind of, when they say, the story tells itself, it's in fact true, in the sense that you start to participate in the truth of that story, and because it's you, and because your characters are unique and stuff like that, and no one is the same, it will be original. So in other words, originality will come from truth. If you look for it, you will never get there, and you will start doing fake stuff. They will feel false just because you're chasing something that's wrong. The other, and I know that wasn't in the question, but there's a cousin to that, or like a sister idea to that, which is the other thing that people are very preoccupied with, is the fear of being too obvious. I don't want to be too obvious. It's too obvious, And the truth is, you're never obvious. In fact, you're never clear enough, and you're always more cryptic than you think. So what you're trying to do is chase truth and trying to get rid of any crypticness that's in your story. And if you do that honestly, the result will be unique, because it's coming from you, and you are a unique person.
Awesome. This next question is asking if you could elaborate more on the quote, "Never have 2 characters talking about a third character who isn't on screen."
Yes, so that has to be to do with the essence of the dramatic form, which is kind of what I was saying, as someone is trying to do something hard, and something bad from their standpoint doesn't even not need to be something bad from everybody else's standpoint. But if you feel like for them it would be bad, or then that it works. And then as an audience, your empathy switch kind of clicks on, and you become that character, right? Like, for instance, you could imagine how many movies have you seen where you start with this guy, and he's a lawyer in this big law firm, and everybody there is fake, and he's a complete douchebag. but but he's trying to close this case, you know what I mean? And he knows that, you know, at the beginning of Act One, right? He's trying to get this case or this client or whatever, and you get the sense that if that doesn't work out, he's getting fired or he's not getting his bonus. I mean, these are such douchey things to want that when you pull out, you know, screw that stuff, right? But when you're in the movie, just the fact that someone is trying hard to get to something and that for them it will really suck if they don't get it, again, something happens in your brain. And that sort of emotion, that reflex that gets emotional reflex, let's call it, that gets triggered, that is what the dramatic form, that is theater, movies, novels, comics, whatever you want, like you know, that's how it works. This is a single engine. That's why I keep saying there is nothing else. And meanwhile, there's something that is a lot easier to do than to create a situation like that, is visual or verbal narration, where basically somebody says something to you, you know, like, oh, Uncle Joe, you know, the movie starts, and it's like also like, you know, making fun of the Agatha Christie things where somebody picks somebody up at the train station, and the car ride, you know, from the train station to the castle is like a 10-minute slice of exposition. Uncle Joe used to work in Africa in the diamond mines, you know, but there was this terrible accident and now he's blind in one eye, you know what I mean? And so that's always two people talking about the third person who's not there. And it's accepted as a trope in certain formats, but in modern movies and outside of the Agatha Christie sort of trope, it's really like something you need to avoid, and it's sometimes very hard to avoid it 100%, but sometimes most of the time you should. And there's also another sort of trope that is also related to that, and that people are starting to identify, you know, in the last few years, in terms of, you know, sexism, is that how many movies do you have where the only good scenes that two women character have is they're talking about a guy who's not there, right? And so you want characters who are invested in themselves trying to do something, and again, they could be doing something to further a relationship with somebody, does not matter, but you want this sort of principle of agency within your characters, and you need to, as an audience, be able to understand and feel that you just get on board with that endeavor, as opposed to having somebody just tell you about it, because that's not the dramatic form. That's a different thing.
Our next question, or group of questions really, is coming from someone who's familiar with a 3-act structure,
Right.
but is wondering how that applies to something more serialized or episodic, like a comic book series or a TV show.
That's also a great question. All the questions are great, by the way. All great. It's exactly all the stuff we I wanted to talk about. So thank you so much. So it really depends really on the format. So you're right. So like, for instance, when I do graphic novels, what you know, for instance, like I finished one silver that I know I've seen some of the that some people are familiar with here. So it's in 4 volumes, and typically I break it down into the 4 acts of a movie, because we said the 3-act structure, but really the second act is like a double act, right? So it's really when we talk acts here in terms of structure, it's 1, 2A, 2B, and 3. So really it's 4, but 2A and 2B, it's nice to call them that because they're, like I was saying, around that hinge points in the middle where things kind of flip over and the movie takes on a different meaning. So, you know, that's what I did for that graphic novel, is like every book is 1 act, again, with a big cliffhanger sort of act break at the end of it. Now, I have to tell you, I'm more versed in the movie form than I am in the TV series form, because I've never really, you know, worked in that format you know, in like creating like something for like a season where your story takes place over 10 hours. So I don't know it as well, to be perfectly honest. But the thing I'm going to say is you do want each episode to have a mini 3-act structure, if you will. So where because you know, a lot of those things are fractal, like I was saying about the dramatic form, that it's for a scene, it's for a sequence, it's for a movie, all works. It's still that same pattern. And I think it's the same, right? Everything has a beginning, middle, and end, you know. So your episode will have a beginning, middle, and end, and there's going to be some sort of choice or disclosure at the end that will work as your thing that really turns the episode. And especially these days, that because it used to be like when you used to watch TV, you know, even 10 years ago, you know, or 15 years ago, you watch things like Lost or the X-Files or whatever, and you're talking about storylines that would take years to unravel. So entire episodes would, you know, would go by without like a real disclosure or anything like that is germane to the actual arc of the but we don't live in that world anymore. We live in like the binging 10-hour stuff, right? So that would be, sorry, that's a very kind of fuzzy and kind of long-winded answer, but I think it's the fractalness of it. Think of it as everything is a beginning, middle, and end, works for the whole season, works for each episode, and you have to organize your dramatic form around that. The thing that I will say that applies to all that stuff, the number one rule of every scene, and it's the same with every movie, is, so again, fractal, is start as late as you can and as early as you can. That is the only rule, right? Start the movie like it couldn't, like if you started it 5 minutes later in the story, it doesn't make sense. Don't start it like an hour before, or you know, or a day before, right? And same with the end of the movie. By the time when you're done, you're done. Point is made, character made the choice, the quantum wave of, you know, tragedy or heroism has collapsed, and now we've filed our characters away in that kind of sort of global story of humanity, or either they've done sins or whatever. Then you're out, right? There used to be this trend in the 80s and early 90s, you know what I mean, when really like the blockbusters were, you know, and we had this trend of like every movie had 3 endings, you know what I mean? And so I think we moved away from that now. That's not so much the thing anymore.
We just got this interesting question that's like, do you know, or do you have any tips for knowing what format or medium is best for the story you're telling? Like when you start writing a story, do you know this is going to be a movie or this is going to be a series?
So that's a great question. And there's actually a lot of different dimensions to that question. The first, so there's basically 2 families of answers for this. There, on one side, you can look at it as a purely creative question, which is, what is the best format creatively to tell this story? That's one side of the question. The other side of the question is, if that's something that I have the ambition that it will turn into like a professional work, in the sense that the industry will be paying for it, you know, then you also have to look at which what type of projects will the industry allow to be made in certain formats. And that's the thing that's changing. It's changed a lot in the last 5 years for the better, in my opinion. But that used to be a huge concern, right? Like there used to be a time where they used to say, no superhero stuff in animation. That's over. No sci-fi in animation. That's over. No, you know, only superheroes in like comics have to be about superheroes. They can't be about everyday slice of life stuff, which is the biggest thing in comics right now. So you have, unless you're really stubborn and really like to make life hard for yourself, you do have to have a certain understanding of where the industry is at, and your odds may be long, but if they're impossible just because you're trying to get them to do something that they will never do, you know, it's a hard road, right? So that you have to understand that. On the other side, I think, creatively speaking, any any genre could be done in any sort of medium. The question, it really becomes how much juice do you have in a character, right? Because really it's about characters. You're telling a character story. So, take a character like Snow White, for instance, right? By the time she's done and she's married, that you've kind of exhausted the scope of what that character was sort of created to deal with, right? Then you could imagine a different story where now she becomes a lawyer in the future and stuff like that. And that's great, whatever. But you can still call her Snow White. It's not the same character, really. It's just you're just reusing the name, which is great because story throughout history is reinventing stuff. But you know what I'm saying? Like if you're if the vision that you have for this character as it was invented at the beginning, right, is what it is, then you probably want to do a movie, right? Not an entire series. Or, if you're doing a work that is really has to do with more like a time period, and where you're exploring a society, you have a lot of characters and their storylines kind of plug into a lot of societal things that maybe you can have a lot of seasons about it because because there's a lot to explore there without sort of just turning around and realizing that the stories ended. So I think that's what I would say is really look at your character, and not your character in the abstract, but your character as in how you're conceiving them in terms of what you are equipped to have them deal with in this story, and what you've equipped them to deal with the story, and what are the brackets within which your character feels relevant. And depending on how much story and how much types of story you can have within those brackets, then that can tell you if you should do a short story and call it a day, or try to plan like a 10-season saga.
Speaking of characters, we're getting actually a lot of questions about characters. One of them being, how do you create dynamic characters?
Yeah. Again, it's always, that's why I keep saying there is nothing else. It's still going back to that form, which is a dynamic character is a character that you completely understand what they're trying to do, and you feel a certain way about it. Whether you're like, oh my God, let's make sure they never get there, or you got, yeah, I'm rooting for you to get there. It doesn't matter. But again, clarity. You're at the beginning, like one of the first questions. I can introduce the thing about clarity. Clarity is everything, because storytelling really is. There's two levels. First level is people need to understand what you're putting down. And level two is then they also need to feel a certain way about it. But they can't feel any way about anything unless they understand. So what's really important is to clarify and honestly, a lot of writing is paring down to what is germane to the story, right? Because there's a concept that I heard about also in story that is called fascinations. And the reason we all do this, what we're doing, is because as children, we've read a book, we've seen a comic, we've watched a movie, a show, whatever. Something captured our imagination, and actually more than one thing, certain things, and we've kind of kept those in our like little library inside our head and our file of awesome stuff. And those are called fascinations. That's why you hear that such or such artist or director or whatever says, oh, now I'm going to do my Western, now I'm going to do my this, now I'm going to do my war story, that this is going to be my this or that, because it's just like doing your take on those fascinations you had. And so the thing with fascinations is that whenever you're creating a new character, a new story, whatever, you're going to always try to shove all of them in there, because you love this shit, right? Except that the story, again, you have to keep it honest, keep it true, and at some point you're like, yeah, maybe there's no place for like a circus in here. Okay, I'm removing, he's not a clown. Okay, fuck that, he's not a clown. Oh, you know what I mean? And so little by little, you can remove the stuff that is not germane to the story. And what you really want to be left with at the end It's a simple idea that it's a small town sheriff who's trying to stop the shark who's eating people. I not only get it, and I feel a certain way about it, and it's one of the biggest movies in history. Or, you know, you could go through every movie that people think of and sometimes overthink in terms of complexity or whatever. Ocean's 11. It's about a con man who's trying to rob a really tough casino from a really scary mobster, but really to try to get his ex-wife back. I get it. I explained Ocean's 11, which has a million moving parts, in like literally 10 seconds, right? So a dynamic character is a character that you can understand what they are trying to do at all times, and that consequently you feel a certain way about it.
Well, I think you also kind of answered this next question, which is asking for any tips on how to write a good synopsis for a pitch.
It's the same form. There's let me give you a counter example, and it's going to touch on some of the concepts I kind of flew through like in the video, but maybe I'll, it'll be more, we'll have examples, right? So a pitch needs to have the form that I keep talking about. It also needs to have the right balance of immediacy versus imagination. Because, if I told you, all right, so it's great. It's a sci-fi movie. It's about planet Zordos. And on that planet, the Gwarki are fighting the Blurko. And because, you know why? Because the essence of life. And you know what happens when they do that? The fifth dimension opens to the seventh dimension. What? And like there's definitely a lot of awesomeness that could be created by any visitive artist from like the words I said, and you understood every single word that I said. And even if I throw in there like the form as, and Gwarku is trying to get the sword of power because otherwise the universe will go bankrupt. What? Right? So you understood every single word I said, but there's no way you can even like try to see where I'm going with this, but you can't feel anything about it because there's no emotional connection to any of those situations that are right. So a pitch, like I was saying, the good ratio that you have is 90% immediacy. Like for instance, when as I've been doing so many conventions over the years where we've been pitching silver to like I want to say 100,000 people. I don't know, at least. So not only we have the pitch memorized, but so it goes like this. It goes, and I'm not saying this to pitch you guys silver, but just because that's a pitch that I know works really well. And it's like so it's a universe that is inspired by Bram Stoker's Dracula. And we're 40 years later into the noir pulp era of the 1930s. And we have this group of con men who team up with this woman who's a vampire hunter to steal precious silver from a castle full of vampires. What could go wrong? So that's the pitch. And that pitch has sold tens of thousands of books. And the reason why is because it's like I was saying, right? You're listening to this and you go like, get it, oh, Dracula, yeah, I know about Dracula. But now we're in the noir pulp era. Oh, I get that. I like noir. And we have this con man. Yeah, cool. And he teams up with this woman who's a vampire hunter. Oh, I can dig that. And they're trying to steal this treasure from a castle full of vampires. What the fuck are you talking about? What? So that's the thing. Yeah, get it. So like a lot of easy gets that are interesting, but you have a familiarity and like an affinity for, but they're being, with the final thing that takes the thing and turns it in a way you did not see that one coming. So that's what you want for a pitch.
Perfect. This is amazing. This next question is asking, what challenges do you face when you're telling a short story as opposed to something like a full-length film? And how do you have any tips for using time wisely for something like a short film?
Yes. So I think there's, when you're working on a story, I think one of the very important aspects is understanding what I call the scope of the story. Like what has to do, there's people who, when I always go, to be honest with you, story is excuse me, story is story. And so um, it's the same when you're telling a joke to a friend, right? If the joke involves, the penguin and the nun in the bar, right? Then don't add, and there's the blind guy, and there's this, and there's the bird flies, because next thing you know, there's so many balls in the air. How do you know which ball you're supposed to be looking at, right? So it's the same with short story. Understand your real estate, understand the point that the story is trying to make. Start as late as you can and as early as you can, and confine the elements in play to the ones that are truly germane to the story, and resist putting all your geeky fascinations that are awesome, but you know what, they don't belong in this one, they belong in the next one.
Our next question is asking, what are ways to build emotional connections to your character and the audience? How can you make the audience care about the characters?
There's only one way. So you there's this belief that, in my view, is completely wrong, that you will care about the characters if you understand them more, if you know more, if you know why they're doing this, if you know, what's their backstory, and so, but you have to ask yourself, and I know it's kind of an older movie, and I know I'm talking to a younger crowd, but it's one of the greatest movies in cinema, and it's one of the best character introduction ever made. Is Dirty Harry. And if you know Dirty Harry, I mean, I think everybody understands the concept of Dirty Harry. But if you have not watched that film, the first one, I think Richard Donner, I think, did the first one. I'm not sure. You have to watch it. It's talk about lean and mean and understanding what the story is about, flipping it in the middle. Everything those '70s movies are incredible. So, anyways, you have to ask yourself, would I care? Would I like this movie more? And would I care about Dirty Harry more if I knew why he is the way he is, right? If there was at some point, he falls asleep and there's this dream of when he was a kid, when his dad was a mean son of a bitch, and or maybe he was bullied at school and he saw this other kid die, and so now he's good, Dirty Harry, justice, you know what I mean? And so it would it would not improve the movie in any way, and most importantly, it would not make you care more about the character, because that is the stuff of real life. Like in real life, you want to know that stuff. If you're working with somebody and they're, or working or whatever, right? You're with somebody, and they're a jerk, and you go like, wait, what's wrong with that guy? If you learn that something terrible happened to them, then you go, okay, I understand why he's that way. Maybe it'll give me the incentive to try to reach out, and maybe we can communicate, blah, blah, blah. That's great. That's real life. That's not story. In story, you as an audience, your empathy switch only activates when you see someone trying to do something hard, and that something bad will happen from their own standpoint if they fail. And that's why I keep saying there is nothing else, because all the answers are in there. And it sounds like such a simple statement, but at the same time, to really create a story or a scene that checks all those boxes cleanly in a way that I can clearly understand without a second thought and feel a certain way about them is very hard.
Our next question is here is asking about your writing process.
Yeah.
When you write, do you sketch out or thumb out storyboards, or do you write first in words like a script and then begin sketching?
That's a great question. It's interesting because I I read a quote by Quentin Tarantino just a couple of days ago, actually, and I was like, man, I can totally relate to that. Not that I'm comparing myself to Tarantino, but that doesn't matter. It's that the idea was the same. And he was saying that when he writes a script, um, he's not thinking about the movie. He's not thinking about angles or when he's going to shoot it or whatever. He's writing the thing as if that script was going to get published as a written document, and that's all it ever is. He would be happy and feel that he's told the story and feel artistically satisfied with it. And I was like, yeah, okay, I can relate to that because that's the same for me. And the reason, and so it's actually, so to answer the first part of the question, is that yes, so here's my process. So I have my fascinations like everybody else. And my fascinations are what? It's a mix of, or no, my concepts. I have my concepts, and my concept is a mix of fascinations that I've had since I was a kid. Like I always wanted to do a thing like this. And somehow, through the years, this clever idea of a high concept, can be like, silver again, Ocean's 11 in Dracula's castle. Oh, great, because I always wanted to do my vampire movie. I always wanted to do my heist movie. And guess what? Put them together. That's clever. And everyone say, okay, great. So perfect. So you have that. And I have about 20 of those in my head that have been there for years. And once in a while, something happens, and all of a sudden, it jumps to the next level where I go like, okay, I know what this is really about. Like the book that I did this year, Palomino, right? Always had this idea to do like a detective story in 80s LA, San Fernando Valley, with the musician / detective and stuff. I always had that concept for years, right? And then suddenly I had this idea that, oh, he's got a daughter. And all of a sudden this kind of this banter, this one scene between them just came out of nowhere. And I was like, and all of a sudden that scene was like, okay, that's my way into this story. And I kind of become obsessed, and I just write that scene. Once I write the scene, I'm like, yeah, that's them. I'm now going to write the story around this, and then it took me a few months to actually find the actual scope of the story and actually write it correctly. But so that's what it is, right? So first you have your fascinations. Then they need to be kind of cross-pollinated with like a clever idea. So, because it's one thing, so I'm going to do a Western. Yeah, okay, there's been a million Westerns. What's special at your Western? Well, it's with goats. Oh, okay, interesting. All right, okay. So there's that. But then until like you get visited by this little voice that tells you, I know what the human meaning of this is, right? And again, in Palomino, it was two things. It was it's a father-daughter story, and it's a specific one, not just like the idea I'm going to do father-daughter, but I could see who they were and what their problem was, and also the sudden vision that the 1980s were not just the death of the 1950s like we've seen in many movies, but they were also the birth of the 2020s, right? And I figured this out in my sense, when I saw this Ronald Reagan 1976 Johnny Carson interview, and I listened to this guy, and I see that what he's pitching is the world we have today, for mostly worse. And I was like, okay, now I know what this thing is about. So at that point, I write until there's a script, like in the words of Tarantino, if it never went beyond that, and it just was this written document that people can read, I would feel like, yes, this is performing the story the best way that I can at this point. And that brings me to the next concept, which is that story is all about performance. Story lives in performance, because as you're performing it, then it comes alive, and it bypasses a lot of mental stuff. And so I have the written thing. Again, once I'm done writing it, I feel like this is the best thing I can ever do with this. I can never top that. And then I start doing my layouts. So I've done a lot of storyboarding in animation in my life. So that's the easy part for me. It's just I get into the cinematic of it, the this, the that, blah, blah. And so quick parenthesis, I never designed the characters beforehand. because my one motto about everything is art is discovered, it's not decided. And I don't have the talent to decide on a character and go, hey, that's it, and then run with it. So like I do my rough sketches, I sketch out the entire book. And by the time I get there, I've kind of found who the characters are visually. And so when I come back and do the actual drawings, now I know who they are because it took me the entire book drawing them, living through a story to figure out visually what they're supposed to look like. So then I do that. And once those pages are done, then I do the lettering. And as I do the lettering, it's also a final dialogue pass, because at that point I realized that either visually some points have been made that very clearly just with the visuals that actually I don't need the words anymore, or in some cases I feel like, yeah, there's a little bit of gap here, and so I'm using a clever way to use dialogue or whatever to bridge that gap. So that's kind of my entire process.
Well, I'm glad you shared that with us. We are reaching the end of our time with you that we have scheduled for you today. So I'd like to give you the chance to maybe pass any last bit of wisdom you want to, or anything you want to plug that might be coming up.
No, I'm not gonna plug anything. You guys just look me up if you want. What I can tell you is this: story is more important now than ever, because propaganda, as I was pointing out in the video, is everywhere. A staggering number of people are believing stuff that is not true, that is demonstrably not true, and that is not helping them and helping anyone. And this is not a partisan statement, it's just a simple statement of truth. Again, stories about the truth. So, and the antidote to that is not counter propaganda. The antidote to this is telling honest story that we can all connect with and come together. That's why everybody, doesn't matter who politically you are, we all love Star Wars. We all love Marvel. We all love, all that stuff, because this is this is why I'm missing the convention so much. Like, over the last few years, again, when I say I've shaken hands and had story and conversation with over 100,000 people, it's not an exaggeration. It's true. And I miss those. And I do not have the illusion that the entire 100,000 people were like sharing all my ideas politically or whatever. Does not matter. I don't care. What matters is that at that moment, we were connecting as people. And as long as we do that, we're not killing each other. So you guys are all storytellers. Go out, tell your stories as honestly as you can. And that's all that is asked of you.
Well, thank you so much for spending some time with us today. We really appreciate it. Everyone here loves story. We're all storytellers visually. Yeah. Even just every day, communicating is storytelling. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, everybody, for hanging in there with me. It's very awesome.
Well, have a great rest of your day. And everyone, thank you so much for your wonderful questions. I'm sorry we couldn't answer them all, but they were all really good questions.
Look me up on social media. I'm always happy to answer stuff. So there you go.
Thank you one last time.
Oh, okay.